You may look at this video and think that it would be boring, as Italy would stay out of the Great War. However, I think that this idea has a lot of potential. By Italy being neutral in the First World War, they would not lose over 500,000 soldiers. But also, as we know from our history, Austria-Hungary collapsed, so Italy, due to self-determination, could have expanded there absolutely for free anyways. In Anatolia, the Italians historically were promised lands there, but couldn't send in soldiers as the country was broken economically and militarily after the war, and here this would not be the case, thus Italy can fight the Turks alongside Greece, and Italy securing Albania is not too impossible, I would imagine. By Italy being neutral in the Great War, I think that ironically they would end up getting more land and influence at the cost of less casualties, which would have great differences in the interwar period. So let me show you what I came up with. First up, a friendly reminder not to take this video too seriously, as I will pursue fun alternate history rather than realism, so keep it in mind. With that out of the way, how do we make Italy to remain neutral in the Great War? Well, there are several ways to do so. First up, the socialists in Italy, or more broadly the working people and the general South, were opposed to any war. We saw this historically in 1919 to 1920, with many socialist strikes throughout northern Italy, starting in Turin. Thus, one way for Italy to remain out of the Great War is if they are led by a socialist government. However, I think that this would result in a very different scenario, that it deserves its own video. I think it's interesting since Mussolini originally started out as a socialist, so he could lead this alternate Italy, but the difference is that the Italians wouldn't expand much after the Great War, which I think would be a boring scenario. However, they can side with the Soviet Union in the Second World War, and thereafter gain a lot of land and influence. So this is why in the future I would make a separate video on this topic, so subscribe if you don't want to miss it. Another way we can make Italy to remain neutral in the Great War is if the Entente fails to convince Italy to switch sides, as perhaps the Italians would see the Treaty of London as a lowball offer, but this is perhaps unrealistic. The Italians historically, but also generally the world at the time, believed that the Great War would end relatively soon, even after Christmas had passed. Thus historically, Italy didn't want to sit idle and not gain any easy spoils of war. This option I think will be very unrealistic, as we would need to change the whole narrative of the war, so I would go with something more simple. Therefore, I think that the most likely option for Italy to remain neutral and after that to expand for free is for their Prime Minister of Giovanni Giolitti to rule for longer. This is also a more interesting option, as when in 1914 historically Giovanni Giolitti was replaced by Antonio Salandra and Italy moved towards joining the Great War. After the war in 1921, Giovanni Giolitti was voted again as Prime Minister, promising to fix the country after the devastation the Great War had caused. Historically, he co-created a national bloc with Mussolini, as they opposed the rise of the socialists, but eventually Mussolini took over and made his dictatorship. Thus, by making Giovanni Giolitti rule for longer, not only does this avoid Italy joining the Great War, which we want for the narrative of the video, but also Italy would remain somewhat nationalist and expansionist, meaning that later on they can expand into Turkey and Albania. Historically, Giovanni Giolitti served 5 terms as Prime Minister, starting from 1892 and ending in 1921, although he was out of office for a while. He is Italy's second longest serving Prime Minister, with the longest one being Mussolini himself. However, Mussolini was not exactly democratically elected in the following decades, while Giolitti was, and thus he was quite popular. Giovanni Giolitti had a few simple policies that made him stay in power for longer. First up, it was the Transformismo, where he basically forced the left and the right to work together in a grand centrist coalition, which kept him in power for longer. He disliked wars, revolutions and extreme ideologies, and thus he favored stability above all else. Historically, Giolitti disliked wars and rightfully realized that Italy was too poor and divided politically and economically to sustain imperial ambitions like France or Britain. Thus, he first sought to improve the country initially. From 1903 to 1914, he successfully industrialized the north, while these reforms failed in the more agrarian south. More on that later. Further, he implemented many social reforms that made him popular with the workers, and his reign is considered by some as the golden age of Italy, although this doesn't tell the full picture. This is because it's reported that voting fraud was extremely common in Italy at the time. Giovanni Giolitti tried to improve this issue by fixing the voting fraud in the more developed areas of Italy that also supported him the most, while attempting to isolate the poorer areas that he didn't enjoy a lot of support in, and there he apparently had to rely on bribes to win. Thus, some see Giovanni Giolitti as a national hero that improved Italy, which is factually correct, but also the opposition even today sees him as a dictator, abusing voting fraud to stay in power. I think that both extremes are valid, and today and even back in the day he was quite a polarizing figure, either you really liked him or hate him heavily. As such, his hold on power was never truly secure in 1914, as he made several mistakes. Firstly, I would qualify him as being liberal and center-left based on his policies, but due to transformismo, he was supported by all sides of the spectrum, besides both extremes. His first mistake was that he sided with the moderate Catholics as to gain more voting power, however the anti-clerical liberals abandoned him due to his move, and thus his grasp on power started to collapse with one simple mistake. Then he failed to handle the Red Week of 1914 in Italy, and everyone in the country wanted to get him out of power, seeing him as weak and coward that wouldn't be able to take any decisive actions. And thus he was replaced by Antonio Salandra, who was very much pro-war than him, and thus by this point Italy was on the path of joining the Great War. As a result of that, for Italy to remain neutral, we need to make Giovanni Giolitti stay in power for longer, at least up until the 1919 election, and by that time the Great War would already be over, so it wouldn't really matter. So how do we make Giovanni Giolitti to remain in power for longer, avoiding the Great War, expanding for free in the interwar period with the help of self-determination, and even more with the collapse of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire? First up, resolving Questione Meridionale I think would be helpful, which translates to the Southern Question, or basically narrowing the divide between North and South Italy, which historically made Italy very disunited politically and economically, and this created internal issues and quite often political chaos. Earlier I mentioned that Giolitti successfully industrialized the north, but his reforms to the south had mostly failed. He understood the problem of Italy being two countries in one. Massimo di Azeglio put it best when he said the famous quote of "We have made Italy, now we have to make Italians." I'm sure that you already know plenty about the north-south Italian divide, so I would not spend too much time here. However, I would try to slightly bridge the gap, thus stabilizing Italy. The south was predominantly controlled by landowners which resisted change, where bandits and mafia presence was especially critical, as to why the central government actually had little control over these territories. To fix this, Giolitti needs to break up the landowners and force them to sell their lands to smaller farmers. He could also create several banks in the region that would help the farmers buy equipment and modernize their farmland, boosting their productivity. Most importantly, I think that he could put taxes on idle land, which I think would be quite easy to implement and be very beneficial, as the south of Italy was not productive at all. The landowners resided mostly in the cities and cared little about their rural holdings, thus the peasants working there were not so productive. As the south was quite rural, there could be efforts to build railroads, roads and ports, generally just infrastructure, which would make exports more viable and thus begin to bridge the gap. Giolitti historically introduced heavy tariffs on Italy, which benefited the north, but since the south didn't have too much of an infrastructure to export produce abroad, they were left behind and didn't quite benefit from these tariffs. In fact, I think that it may have hurt them in the long run. Thus, Giolitti dealing these tariffs I think would also be very beneficial for the south as well. Basically, I'm proposing an earlier creation of the Southern Development Ministry, where similar organizations exist in Italy even today. There could be policies that would only apply to the north of Italy, while the south would have some special economic zones, where perhaps there would be fewer taxes as to incentivize growth. All of this would start in about the year of 1903, and for a decade nothing too notable would change, as these reforms would have to take a lot of time to succeed, but Italy would now be somewhat less divided, and Giovanni Giolitti would enjoy larger support from southern small landowners and peasants. Now, one thing that would be very beneficial for Italy is for them to avoid their war with the Ottoman Empire in 1911, as it costed billions of lira and didn't accomplish much. Giovanni Giolitti was against the war, but to put it simply he said, "I was forced to yield to public opinion. If I had resisted, the entire government would have fallen." And later on he would add, "We have taken a desert and called it an empire." The war itself was very costly, numbers are hard to find, but Italy spent about 25% of their budget of 1911 to 1912 to win this war against the Ottomans, where they simply got Libya, which was not too valuable at all. In fact, later on it would become an even larger money drain, as the Muslim population there remained hostile and loyal to the Ottomans, as there were constant revolts and basically no benefits for Italy, outside of it getting strategic control on the Mediterranean Sea for Italy. To put it simply, Italy spent about 15.3% of their GDP to gain Libya, which is a lot. On average, they spent about 3.3 million lire a day, where they expected to spend one third of this historically. I bring up the cost per day because the Eiffel Tower costed 7.8 million French francs, and while conversion rates are difficult to be accurate, for certain we can say that Italy each 3 to 4 days of the war was spending enough to build an Eiffel Tower, and the war lasted for 13 months. Another interesting comparison is the Manhattan Project, where to keep it simple, Italy's war with the Ottomans costed about 1/7 of the Manhattan Project. The final comparison I want to make, because I quite enjoy researching about this and I hope that you're liking it as well, is that at the time it costed about 3 million lire per 100 kilometers of railroad in Italy. Basically, each day in the war, the money used could have been eventually used to build 100 kilometers of railroad. And in the end, the war costed so much that Italy could have built over 40,000 kilometers of railroad, which would be more than what Italy had prior to the war, which I hope just goes to show how costly this war actually was. And I'm not going to go in detail regarding how useless Libya was, as I think that you can simply look at the map and see for yourselves. This is not to say that Italy would have hundreds of Eiffel Towers, the best railroads or nuclear weapons if they didn't spend so much on this war, but it just goes to show that they spent a lot of money and didn't gain anything besides hostile rebels. Now, avoiding this war could be possible, as Giovanni Giolitti was against it and he was the prime minister, but due to public pressure he had to cave in. Surely we can prevent Italy in engaging in this war as well, however I don't want to do that, as after it historically happened, the Balkan states attacked the Ottomans, which were weakened. Then the Balkans fought each other, which is a very important prelude to the start of the Great War. If Italy didn't weaken the Ottomans and expose their weakness, perhaps the Ottomans would not be attacked by the Balkan states thereafter, which would greatly change the Great War, making it very difficult to predict, so simply I would be sticking to what happened historically, as then it's easier to predict. What we can change, however, is how much Italy would spend on this war. Historically, Italy used modern ships, aircraft and a full naval blockade on the Ottomans, all of which were very expensive, and we know how bad of a state the Ottoman Empire was in, so it was perhaps a little overkill, and the Italians definitely overspent on this war. As a fun fact, Italy was the first country to use airplanes for military purposes, and it happened during this exact war. With the Italians wanting to spend less on their war against the Ottomans in 1911 to 1912, it could actually result in several severe changes. Italy would still blockade the Ottomans and isolate Libya, where they would successfully take the coastline, while this time around they would avoid fighting inland and instead try to use diplomacy. The Italians could make a deal with the Ottomans, where the country is still part of them officially, but in reality it would be Italian, much like how Britain grabbed Egypt and Cyprus, but officially annexed them in 1914, when they were at war against the Ottomans. Historically, the Ottomans lost Libya to Italy, but still had some soft power over the territory. For example, they were allowed to appoint local Muslim religious leaders, and Italy only had real control in the coastline. Further, historically, the Italian control over Libya was very weak, as the interior became ruled by the Senussi order, which was loyal to the Ottoman Empire, plus many Ottoman soldiers and officers never left Libya, but instead they sided with local militias and continued fighting against Italy, even after the peace treaty. Now in this alternate history, with Italy wanting to spend less on this war, the first massive change is that they would have much less control over the interior, thus making the Senussi order much larger, but the second change I'd like to make is even more important. Historically, during the war, the Italians not only fully navally blockaded the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, but also successfully landed in the Dodecanese Islands, which they kept after the war. Originally they were supposed to be used as a bargaining chip and later returned to the Ottomans, but this never happened until the end of the Second World War, when these islands went to Greece. In this alternate history, with Italy spending less on their war, I don't think that they would actually take Rhodes, which would be a big deal later on in the scenario. You would see why. So what we have changed is that Italy has saved at least half of their military budget, which they historically spent on the war, and earlier I said how this could be used to build several hundreds of kilometers of railway track, but also it could be reinvested into the south of Italy, helping stabilize the Italian kingdom greatly. With that, I believe that Giovanni Giolitti is quite in a stable position not to get replaced in 1914, so he would continue to push for policies of neutrality. In the July crisis, Italian interests would be represented by Giolitti, but this wouldn't prevent the outbreak of the Great War. What would immediately happen is that Italy would declare full neutrality, which they weren't willing to do historically. Instead, the nation would focus internally, but they would begin to benefit greatly from the war itself. This is because Italy was right in the middle of it, but also they had good relations with both sides. Therefore, they can do some good all-war profiteering and sell weapons to both sides, which would enrich the Italians greatly. The extent of this would be impossible to predict, but in a previous upload regarding Austria-Hungary's problems in the Great War, I explored how they were lacking in everything, and from 1916 onwards, even food and half of their helmets were German-made. I don't think that Italy would be supplying Austria-Hungary with some lethal weapons like artillery or rifles, as the Italian nationalists would still claim their territory. However, Italy can sell non-lethal equipment to the Austro-Hungarians, like the earlier mentioned food and helmets. Further, as the British historically blockaded Germany and Austria-Hungary, they began lacking in food and raw resources, which hindered their war economy and production. Historically, the Germans traded with the Dutch, Swedes and even Swiss, but all of these combined would be more insignificant than Italy itself, which could produce a lot of food, would have sea access and a colonial empire, but also borders Austria-Hungary directly, so Italy's trade with the Central Powers would partially alleviate the devastating effects of the British blockade. The Italians would need to balance out both sides as to not get involved in the war, so they would also be selling equipment to France and Britain, or allow them to use some of their naval bases in the Mediterranean, so thus neutrality would be forced upon Italy, and revenue from the war would start flowing and improving the Apennine Peninsula. I would compare this alternating neutral Italy to Switzerland in the Great War. The Swiss initially saw their economy to greatly dip due to all of their neighboring countries going to war and switching to war economy, thus they had no major need for Swiss consumer goods. However, the Swiss adapted quickly and switched their production to war equipment, and thus the industrial sector modernized due to wartime demand. The Swiss franc remained as one of the only stable currencies during wartime, and overall Switzerland greatly benefited from this war happening around them. Now, Italy would be in a similar position. They would sell war equipment to the Entente and the Central Powers. They would reinvest these profits into making more equipment, and eventually Italy would be quite industrialized by the end of the Great War, being in a much better position than historically. Not only does Italy profit from this war, but likely their currency becomes an unofficial reserve currency in Europe, at least during the war, as Italy would be the biggest economy in Europe that wouldn't be actively at war, while historically it was the Swiss. Here, Italy would have an immense soft power with their currency being used worldwide as to purchase weapons or food, giving Italy a lot of political leverage they can use later on. Italy would also develop their banking sector sooner, perhaps not as much as the Swiss, but in this alternate history I did say that Italy would create several banks in the south of Italy, as to help the region out, so I can basically see Italy to replace Switzerland's role in the Great War. This also means that spies are going to meet in Italy rather than Switzerland, which was historically infested with spies from both sides, and even Lenin was in Switzerland before being sent to Russia. These spies sometimes negotiated with each other and shared their views on post-war world and the exact redrawing of borders, so all of this happening over Italian soil further gives Italy some more leverage points, where indirectly they can shape how the post-war treaties would be drawn, without actively fighting in the war itself. Over the entire course of the war, the Italian economy would grow by up to 40%, considering everything that I have outlined so far, while historically after the unification they were growing by 0.6% per year, and in the early 1900s they grew by 1.3% each year. Here the Italians can grow their economy by so much, and their growth in this time span of 4 years of the Great War would grow the Italian economy by as much as the previous 14 years. To put it simply, I think that the Italian economy would grow by about 4% per year, rather than 1.3, which was their historic rate of growth. In half a decade, Italy's economy would increase to up to 40%, which surely would be very significant, but the good news for them wouldn't stop here. Obviously, by Italy being neutral in the Great War, they don't fully mobilize their armies and prepare for war, which would save a lot of money, but most importantly would prevent the total disaster that was the Italian front. I don't want to go in detail about it, as it wouldn't matter for this scenario since Italy would be out of the war, but historically it was an absolute train wreck. 11 battles were fought on the Isonzo River, which I would say were basically a stalemate, as neither side achieved anything major until late 1917, when the Austro-Hungarian armies managed to win the Battle of Caporetto and advanced in the Venetian plains. In the end of the war, Italy had lost around 650,000 soldiers as killed in combat, not to speak of the countless more that were wounded and unable to work and integrate into the post-war society. Without an Italian entry into the war, unsurprisingly the Central Powers would perform a lot better than historically. For example, historically Austria-Hungary had to divert over 600,000 troops from the east and the Balkans as to defend the Alps, which was a big deal. Another example is the Brusilov offensive in 1916, which happened because Austria-Hungary repositioned their armies, sending their veteran soldiers to the Italian front and leaving inexperienced units to guard against Russia, which resulted in the Austro-Hungarian disaster after the Brusilov offensive and brought Romania into the Entente. Here in this alternate history, as Italy is not in the war, Austria-Hungary wouldn't send their best soldiers on that front, thus they would instead face the Russian army. What I can see happening is either for the Austrians to hold a lot better, or for Russia to still push them out, but Romania still joins the Entente, however they would be much easily consolidated by the Central Powers. If the first option happens and Austria-Hungary manages to contain these Russian incursions, the Romanian entry into the war on the side of the Entente may happen later than historically, and with Russia looking more unstable, or if they're out of the war, Romania would be unlikely to join, which could be a big deal. For the purpose of this alternate history, I would assume that Romania joins the war but a bit later, perhaps in very early 1917, where they would be still capitulated rather soon, like historically, but this time the Russian provisional government would be established, and the whole Austro-Hungarian might would be focused on defeating Russia, rather than stationing many soldiers on the Alps. Another change we can see is that Germany historically had to send many divisions to help out Austria-Hungary several times, which weakened their offensive capabilities to the Western Front, against France and Belgium. Here, as Austria-Hungary would have about an extra 500,000 soldiers, due to these not being needed to be stationed in the Alps, I think it would result in Austria-Hungary to do ever so slightly better. Here in this alternate history without Italy in the war, Germany would also do better against the French, although I don't see any meaningful changes, at most they would win the Battle of Verdun, but this doesn't guarantee a victory if it were to happen. Finally, I want to mention another change that would be altered here, and this was that historically Italy was able to inflict over 1.2 million casualties on Austria-Hungary, which includes killed in combat, wounded, deserted and captured as prisoners of war. Not only does this not happen here, but also the Battle of Vittorio Veneto in 1917 would not happen at all, which is considered as the final nail in the coffin for Austria-Hungary and therefore the empire disintegrated. Believe it or not, the Austro-Hungarian army suffered its worst morale collapse on the Italian front, rather than the Russian on the Serbian one. With all of that being said, you can see how the Central Powers would be doing a lot better, plus earlier I mentioned how Italy would be trading with them food and potentially war equipment, helping them alleviate the devastating British blockade. So the Central Powers are absolutely not collapsing in the year of 1918, and I can see them to go into 1919. Exactly when the Great War ends I think is difficult to say, but I think the Entente were in a far better position to win the conflict, with America being brought into the war on their side, as I consider it by this point for their victory to be inevitable, and now we have not changed anything for this to be prevented. This is really important as with the war being longer, America would have a larger say in the peace treaty, and thus more self-determination, which I would cover in the peace treaty slightly in a bit. Regarding how the Great War goes, I think that Russia still capitulates at about the same time as historically, and the Central Powers would establish their puppet governments in Eastern Europe, and force the Bolsheviks to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Therefore, the Germans would have more resources to keep the war going for longer, and here the full Austro-Hungarian army can go south to the Macedonian front, while Germany rushes west as to fight against France. What this means in this alternate history in all reality is that Germany and Austria-Hungary would all be fighting on one front, as Italy is not in the war. This means that Bulgaria would not leave the war so early on, as historically they had an army mutiny that forced the government to surrender due to the poor position. But here Austria-Hungary has their full might in Macedonia, thus preventing many Bulgarian losses. The Ottoman Empire, however, is still screwed. I can see them to receive some more support from their allies, but they would be still fighting in the Levant and Iraq, where the situation would be dire and unsavable. Thus, with Italy being neutral in the Great War, I think that the Ottoman Empire would be the first Central Powers member to capitulate instead of Bulgaria, and I would have it happen in February of 1919. Bulgaria would follow quite soon, I would say in April of 1919, where Austria-Hungary would begin to suffer plenty of internal issues and the empire would begin to disintegrate, which would have to fully happen in June of 1919 if we keep up the same timetable like it was historically. Germany would keep up the fighting for a little bit longer, but eventually they would surrender somewhere in July of 1919, so the Great War would be about 9 months longer than historically, had Italy decided to stay out. Now I want to say that this is just alternate history, and this is my own opinion and interpretation of the war, so don't take it as a concrete fact or anything, it's all just for entertainment. The thing is that I can see the Central Powers to fight for a little longer due to Eastern Europe being on their side and providing resources, so they could be fighting all the way up until 1920, however I would stick with my original idea of July 1919. This is because most likely tanks would be used, where the Entente would grow their arsenal and the tanks would actually have an advantage over the defenders, and the Austro-Hungarians weren't so committed on making such a technology, so they would be inevitably defeated. Now let me cover the peace treaty, which by the way would be very different from what we had historically, mostly due to the war being more devastating, being longer and more American involvement, thus more of their influence on the peace treaty. Now I would apply the historic peace treaty but with a neutral Italy, and would do some changes from here, as it would be the easier option. Germany likely looks the same in terms of territory, but I can see their war reparations and army limitations to be more harsh than historically, while the country is also more destroyed, so communism could become much more popular in Germany, and thus the Weimar Republic would be much more unstable. In terms of territory, at most I can see them to lose parts of East Prussia to Poland, due to the war being longer and due to self-determination, but that's about it. Hungary I think could actually be larger, where they would get to keep northern Transylvania, again due to self-determination, plus Romania would have performed way worse due to Austria-Hungary, having 500,000 extra soldiers on this front line, so I think this is possible. Further, in southern Slovakia, I can see for it to go to Hungary instead. However, this is much more unlikely, as Czechoslovakia historically succeeded quite well diplomatically, and just about got everything they could ever want. For the purpose of this video, as it would make it different from what happened historically, I would make Hungary a bit larger. The first and immediate change we could see happening in this alternate world is that the Hungarian Soviet Republic may never rise to power and be defeated by their neighboring countries, where Romania historically occupied Budapest, so Hungary's prestige wouldn't be so much shattered and Trianon would be less harsh. In Yugoslavia, I can see the former Austro-Hungarian territories to be slightly harder to integrate, as Serbia would be capitulated for longer, and Austria-Hungary would consequently also hold on to them for longer. Still, the idea of forming Yugoslavia was very popular, so I think it would happen eventually. However, the union would be much less stable than historically, and it already in our history almost collapsed in 1929, so I think that we could see a weaker Yugoslavia in this alternate history. However, with Italy not being in the war, they would have no way of demanding Dalmatia, where historically they only got Zara, so in this alternate history Zadar would be part of Yugoslavia instead. Bulgaria on the other hand, I can see them as basically getting the same peace treaty as historically. Now let me cover Italy. Although they wouldn't fight in the war, or perhaps they could have joined it in very late 1918 or early 1919 as to get some easy gains, the Italians would either grow in size for free or with a brief war. Either way works. Earlier I mentioned how spies negotiated between each other in Switzerland, which now would happen in Italy, and how the Italians would have some leverage on how the continent would look after the war. Due to self-determination, I can see the entirety of South Tyrol to still go over to Italy. Sure, the northern portion was overwhelmingly Austrian and German speaking, however Austria was left broken after the Great War, and basically became a failed state, as they lost the industry to Czechoslovakia, their grain production to Hungary and so on, which made the Austrians very desperate and wanting to join Germany instead. Historically, Vorarlberg even petitioned to join Switzerland, which the local people very much wanted, however the Swiss decided to go against it. In a similar fashion, we can see South Tyrol to petition to join Italy, where the Italians would accept and give them a special autonomy status, which I would cover like so. Istria I think would see the same fate, although with not exactly these borders that Italy got after the Great War, however I would choose them for simplicity's sake. In Central Europe, Italy basically expands more or less like historically, barring them not getting Zara in Dalmatia. Fiume was historically established as a free state, as Italy and Yugoslavia couldn't agree on who should get it, and since it's a small territory that you probably didn't even realize existed on the map, I would make them an independent nation like historically. With that, these would be the borders of Europe right after the war. However, you may have noticed that I had not talked about the Ottoman Empire, and how they would be succeeded by Turkey, and this is on purpose. I think that the Ottomans would be carved out like historically, except that Italy would not get the southern Anatolia, which was promised to them in the Treaty of London. However, the Turks led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk would manage to defeat France, Britain and Greece, and reverse many of the harms of the Treaty of Sèvres and replace it with a more lenient Treaty of Lausanne. This is very important, as now Italy would be in a position to actually exploit the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which historically they were unable to achieve due to their great losses in the Great War and total economic collapse, which here is absolutely not the case. First up, Italy can annex Libya if they hadn't done it already, where they would try to provoke the Ottomans. Greece and Turkey would still engage in their war like historically, however the Greeks likely have the Dodecanese Islands instead of Italy, perhaps getting them after the First Balkan War. In this alternate history, the Ottoman Empire and therefore Turkey would be much more exhausted, as they had to fight for about 9 months longer and were occupied for several months longer as well, so Greece would have a slight advantage, as during the Great War they would mostly sit on the mountains and wait for the Central Powers to break. Italy here is in a very advantageous position, as they are the only European great power that was not part of the Great War, while everybody around them would be destroyed and in debt, with their populations becoming strongly anti-war. The Italians would have become very wealthy and avoided 650,000 direct casualties, so they are in a position to freely expand, while the rest of Europe is busy dealing with itself. I'll explore the Italian state and generally the economies of Europe a bit later on, but now let me focus on the alternate Greco-Turkish War. Here in this alternate history, as the Italians wouldn't have taken to the Deccanese Islands due to them wanting to spend less on their war against the Ottomans in 1911, this means that Italy and Greece would actually have good relations in this alternate history, and Italy could begin to see how they can dominate the Mediterranean Sea, with the first stepping stone being getting lands in Turkey. Now, would Italy abandon their neutrality and decide to become a warmongering nation in 1919? Well, I would be real with you, this is unrealistic. The most realistic outcome is that Italy does not, however they wouldn't become ultra-nationalist, and in the Second World War would side against Germany, to which I have already made a video about, so to keep this video very different I would be making it a lot more unrealistic, just keep that in mind. In this alternate history, Giovanni Giolitti would be replaced by Antonio Sawandra in 1919, where Italy would have a general election. Giovanni Giolitti is replaced because, like historically, the Italian nationalists would turn on him and see him as weak and too scared to take a decisive action. Thus, the much more pro-war Antonio Sawandra or similar figure would be democratically elected in 1919. Their first moves would be in Albania, where historically Italy had plenty of soldiers after the Great War, and they even attempted to coup the government and make Albania an Italian protectorate, which failed historically. In this alternate history, Italy likely still engages in similar operations, but this is much more controversial on the international stage, and Italy is likely scrutinized by the League of Nations, but nothing would happen. Italy did have a lot of influence over Vlor and hoped to annex it, even in our history, while here their army would be much more better equipped and prepared for war, so I think that the Italians would easily take Albania, annex Vlor and make the rest a protectorate. Yugoslavia would not like this one bit, as now their Adriatic coastline is fully surrounded and dominated by Italy, so the balance of power there would have totally shifted, as Italy would control a few choke points. There would be a diplomatic crisis there, that's for sure, but basically in the end, Italy does get to keep their protectorate over Albania, while there is some free passage treaties being signed between Italy and Yugoslavia, so the crisis would cool off. In July of 1920, the Greek war against Turkey would have escalated, and now Greece would control the entirety of Thrace, but also much of the Aegean coastline. By this point, France and Britain would have mostly left Turkey alone and signed separate peace treaties with them, but Greece would continue their war against Turkey, where they would be performing quite well. Italy is now in a position where they can easily expand for free there, so I believe that in 1921 they would join the war on the side of Greece, as the two nations would be somewhat very close due to the Rhode Islands issue being resolved, while both would be led by somewhat liberal governments, and I think that they would work together, this is guaranteed. I don't want to overcomplicate this war too much, but Italy would show up in great numbers and occupy the coastline, while providing Greece with material support and keeping them in the war for longer. Due to the former Ottoman Empire and now Turkey being a lot more destroyed in this alternate Great War, I think that their odds at victory would be very slim. Historically, with the Treaty of Kars, the Soviet Union and Turkey determined their official border, where the Soviet Union, despite fighting a civil war, still decided to send money over to Turkey, as the Soviets wanted to weaken France and Britain. Historically, the Soviet support proved helpful, but it was not a deal breaker. However, it may not happen in this alternate history. I will later on tell you why when I cover the Soviet Union. So literally everything would be stacked against the Turkish side. Thus I can see Greece and Italy to become victorious in this war, where Greece would annex Thrace, Izmir and the surrounding areas, while agreeing to Constantinople becoming a free city as a compromise for the time being. While Italy would get plenty of influence in the south of Anatolia, which for fun I would call the Karaman Republic, being a protectorate of Italy. In the end, the Ottoman Empire would be partitioned like so, and Turkey would lose Istanbul among other areas, which would be vital for their long-term success, and I think that we may have very well killed the rise of Turkey in this alternate history. Them becoming more socialist is absolutely possible, but I would cover this a bit later on, when I explore the interwar politics. Now, why has the Soviet Union not sent help into Turkey, while historically they could do that during their civil war? Well, this is because the Soviet Union here would be in an even more terrible position. Let me explain. Historically, the Central Powers defeated Russia in 1918, with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk being signed on the 3rd of March 1918, with many states getting their independence, being subjects of Germany. Historically, the Great War ended 9 months after that, and these states were later on absorbed into the Soviet Union mostly, although Poland managed to gain some of Western Ukraine and Belarus. Now in this alternate history, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk would be signed a month or two earlier, let us say January 1918, while the war would end in June 1919, so these states would be independent for about a year and a half in total, thus stating that the Soviet Union would have a much harder time reintegrating them back in the fold, hence why they would prioritize doing this over sending help to Turkey. In the Polish-Soviet War, I think that Poland could still have the advantage for similar reasons, so I would make them expand ever so slightly more into Ukraine, while taking Minsk from the Belarusian SSR. Thus now most of Belarus would actually be in Poland, which would have some effects internally in the Soviet Union, where perhaps the Belarusian SSR is absorbed into Russia instead. Another smaller change is that Finland and the Soviet Union may not sign the Treaty of Tartu in 1920, or it would look very different, where historically Finland gave up Repola and Pujararvi, but gained Petsamo. Here the Soviets would be in a worse position, so I think that Finland could get to keep Repola and Pujararvi either way, resolving the Karelian question in their favor. With that, these would be the immediate changes and consequences of the Great War, with Italy being neutral. However, I want to explore the interwar period and the build-up to the Second World War, and how it would be massively changed. First up, Europe would be left in ruins, as the war is not only 9 months longer, but it is also more devastating on their industries, manpower and resources. This is again due to tanks, where for example in the beginning of the war in 1914 it was not devastating yet, mostly due to trench warfare, the front lines briefly moving and nothing ever happening, but historically by the end of 1918 tanks and airplanes were used as to bombard and destroy enemy positions much more efficiently, and thus more devastation would be caused in these mere extra 9 months. All of the participants in the Great War would initially be worse off in the 1920s, no matter victors or losers. As Italy was historically poorer compared to Western Europe, due to this war the Italians would begin to catch them up, but also would begin to benefit economically due to their currency being used unofficially as a reserve currency during the war. As coins back in the day were made out of gold and silver, this basically means that Italy would get a lot of gold and silver by the end of the war, so their reserves would be the highest in the conflict. Basically, all of Europe would sell their gold and silver for Italian lira as to fund their war, instead of Swiss francs, so Italy would become incredibly wealthy in the interwar period, as their more powerful neighbors just blew each other up. Now yes, France is still more powerful than Italy due to them having a higher population, larger colonial empire, better development, more industrialization and so on. However, the French would be much more destroyed than historically, so in the beginning Italy would be the hegemon over Europe, which gives them incredible power. First up, with the collapse of Austria-Hungary, I think that Italy can extend their influence to Central Europe by collaborating heavily with Austria and Hungary individually, which they historically did with the Rome Protocols in 1934, however it could happen much sooner here. Thus, Italy would basically monopolize trade in these countries. Technically they would establish free trade, but since Austria and Hungary would be very much destroyed, they would be forced to trade mostly with Italy due to these free trade clauses, so this bloc would greatly benefit the Italians. Greece and Italy would also have amazing relations, so I can see the Greeks to get invited as well to this economic alliance, while it expanding to Spain and Portugal is also not too impossible, however I would not cover them right now. For now, all you need to know is that Italy is uncharacteristically strong and very influential, which is no surprise as all economies of Europe would be crippled, except that one of Italy, giving them more influence than historically. France and Britain are likely going to oppose this Italian expansion, although unofficial. However, these countries would likely still owe money to Italy in the form of debt that they would have accumulated during the Great War, so they are absolutely unlikely to do anything major, and would likely leave Italy be and crave down their own sphere of influence in Europe. By the year of 1925, I would assume that Europe would look like this, and I hope that you can already comprehend the political situation and how Italy would become a powerhouse in this alternate history, where the North-South divide would be less noticeable and the country would be more united, more wealthy and stronger than ever. Now I think that Europe would see a surge of communism/socialism popularity due to the Great War being much more destructive, so the previous Spartacus uprising in Germany may actually succeed and turn the nation communist oriented, while a similar event could happen in Turkey as well, although for Turkey I have no clear idea. Now Germany I find really interesting, as I don't think that ultranationalism would likely take hold over the nation. This is because ultranationalism originally started in Italy with the rise of Mussolini, the creation of the mutilated victory theory and the general instability of Italy in the early 1920s, where at one point half of the country's workers were on strike. All of this never happens here and the rise of socialism never happens in Italy, so there would be a lot less violence there. On a side note, as historically Italy felt mutilated and getting less than promised lands in the Treaty of London, not only did Mussolini rise to power, but also France and Britain gave territorial concessions in Libya and Italian East Africa, making the Italian colonies larger. As Italy wouldn't be participating in the Great War in this alternate history, the Western Entente is absolutely unlikely to give said territorial concessions, unless they're going to sell these territories, but for the purpose of this video I would assume this not to be the case. Going back to Germany, without the rise of ultranationalism in Italy, the German ultranationalists would be also altered. Instead, it would be mostly ex-war veterans and militarist parties, making a nationalist front to combat the rise of socialism. As the nationalist parties would be much less united than historically, I can see them to become weaker and for the socialists to grow a lot stronger. And thus there could be a brief civil war in Germany, where the communists would have a great shot at coming out on top. However, I cannot predict any of this. When the 1929 Wall Street crash would happen, France and Britain would absolutely be screwed, as due to the Great War being longer, they would have been much more reliant on the United States of America for loans, and thus they would see plenty of instability, more so than historically. Further, Italy was historically impacted quite harshly by the Great Depression. However, here I don't believe this to be the case, and I think that they would actually become stronger once again. This is because in this alternate history, Italy wouldn't be dependent on America in any way, and are unlikely to have any major loans to them, as they wouldn't take any during the Great War, so they would not be impacted. However, their trading partners would be, which would cause a dip in exports for Italy, so they would also be impacted, just not by as much. In fact, it can be France and Britain that would be in debt to Italy rather than just America, and this is why earlier I said that the expansion of Italian East Africa and Libya could still happen, as Italy could waive the debts in exchange for these territories. Italy can also request Malta and Tunisia as to forgive the debt, but I don't see France and Britain to agree to this, although it could be interesting. It all depends on how severe the Great Depression is and how badly hit France and Britain would actually be. For the sake of this video, I would go down a very unrealistic path as to have some cool world building, so Italy would acquire Tunisia and Malta and even pay for these, which would help France and Britain recover better. Plus, I would have Germany to go communist in this alternate history, and this communist threat in Germany could exactly make France and Britain want to sell their colonies, due to the rise of socialism in their own respective countries, where, let me remind you, if the socialists come to power, then France and Britain would be losing control over their colonies regardless, so I think that they could decide to opt to sell Tunisia and Malta to Italy and keep the rest of their colonial empire. By the time of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, I think that Italy would back Franco, while the Soviet Union and Germany would support the Spanish Republic. Considering how much Italy historically spent on Spain, I think that the nationalists would still come out on top, as likely France and Britain would at least tolerate them, with France especially maybe deciding to bite the bullet and support Franco, rather than allowing Spain to turn communist and for France to be encircled. In the 1930s, I think that Italy would expand their own protocols, which I would be simply calling the Axis, to include Portugal, Spain, but also surprisingly Poland as well. This is because Poland would be very isolated between two communist countries, which had partitioned them historically, and would also be desperate to find allies, plus they would have issues with Czechoslovakia over the border, and Poland was very friendly towards Hungary, so I think that this makes sense. For now this is an economic alliance, but more clauses would be later on added as to create a military alliance. France, Britain and the countries in the Benelux will form the Allies, as I would be calling them, while Scandinavia would also be leaning towards them, and on the other side you have the Comintern of Germany, the Soviet Union and potentially Turkey as well. In the end, I think that by the year of 1940 that Europe would be split between these three factions. As you can see in the Balkans, many nations are yet to pick a side, with Yugoslavia now being much more unstable due to the earlier mentioned issues and how popular Tito was, and in general Croatian separatism. I think that eventually the country could become a lot more socialist, while Bulgaria may turn socialist as well, due to their historic link to Russia and their desperate position. Historically, it was Italy and Bulgaria that had very good relations, as there was even a royal marriage in 1930, where Boris III married the Italian princess Giovanni, which would never happen in this alternate history, and this never happens because Italy is closely allied with Greece, a rival of Bulgaria. So George II could marry Princess Giovanna of Italy rather than Elizabeth of Romania, so thus Greece would be even more binded into the Axis. Czechoslovakia is unlikely to join neither the Comintern nor the Axis, so I can see them to lean towards the Allies. Romania would also be in a weird position. They would be unlikely to join the Axis due to Hungary being there and the whole Transylvania issue, while they would be unlikely to join the Comintern due to Soviet pressure on their border and general public fear of the Soviet Union. So their best shot at an alliance would be with the Allies. However, they would be very far away from them to receive help if war were to break out, so I think that Romania could become quite isolated. Eventually, the Soviet Union could test the waters and invade them and seize Bessarabia, but not Bukovina, while Bulgaria, if they're socialists, could seize southern Dobruja. Tensions would be building in Europe, and since this scenario is bonkers already, why not end it with a bang by starting a very unrealistic conflict? I have no idea how this does start, as there would be many hotspots, but let's assume that something happens between the Allies and the Comintern, where the Axis eventually join the Allies or are attacked either way. I think that looking at this map you can see which side would have the advantage, as Germany, Bulgaria and Yugoslavia would be very much isolated, and although Germany and the Soviet Union would be very strong, the problem is that Communist Germany is very unlikely to be tolerated by France and Britain, if they started remilitarizing and breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, so I can see a definitely weaker Germany, while the Soviets are about the same strength. Considering all of this, Europe would be in total war, with more countries eventually being involved than at the start of the Second World War historically. I think that Germany would easily be crushed by France, Britain and surprisingly Czechoslovakia, which was very strong historically, but gave up without a fight. Yugoslavia and Bulgaria were truthfully very insignificant and quite poor peasant states, so they are unlikely to put up much of a fight as well, while Turkey would be weak, however due to geography they can easily defend themselves. Eventually, the European continent would be basically going on a crusade against Bolshevism, where I can see them to absolutely be victorious, but at a very heavy cost, and this war would likely take just about 5 years. And I know that I'm glossing over it, but I think that the peace treaty is a lot more interesting to be discussed. There, Germany would be screwed once again, with Poland, Czechoslovakia and France expanding there. However, Poland wouldn't take as much as they did historically, as the Poles had no desire to expand west into these German majority territories, and instead historically Stalin forced this upon them, so I expect some border corrections and Poland just taking East Prussia. Now I think that Germany will be partitioned, as the Americans are unlikely to be involved in this war, so the European imperialists will do what they do best. I think that since Winston Churchill would be leading this alternate United Kingdom, that his plans would be mostly followed through. Basically, there would be a West Germany on the Rhine River, likely being a French protectorate, and then a North and South Germany, with Austria expanding greatly and leaving us with these borders for Germany. As for Turkey, Greece, Italy, France and Britain would expand even more there, while Greece could also be allowed to annex Constantinople, which prior to that was a free city. Bulgaria would lose southern Dobruja to Romania, and I can see them to lose some bordering territories to Greece, like parts of Thrace and some mountain passages. Yugoslavia I think would absolutely crumble here. Italy would take their claimed territories on the Dalmatian coast, Austria would expand into Slovenia, Hungary would take Vojvodina and West Banat, and since Albania is an Italian protectorate, they can also take parts of Kosovo and Macedonia. The rest of Yugoslavia I think would balkanize itself, with these states getting independence, and I can see Montenegro to become an Italian protectorate, where Italy would basically annex Kotor from them, leaving us with these borders in the Balkans. As for the Soviet Union, obviously they would get crushed and communism would collapse there, with many states getting their independence, including Ukraine, the Caucasus and Central Asia. Romania would regain Bessarabia, while Finland could take the opportunity to expand into the Kola Peninsula, which could happen if there was a winter war prior to this point, which is not too unreasonable. Poland I don't think would expand as much, although I can definitely see them to take more of Belarus and potentially even Ukraine itself, however it's hard to say. The Baltics would not have participated in this war most likely, however they would be larger than historically, except for Lithuania, as the Soviets historically annexed parts of them in 1939 and never gave these territories back. Zooming out, this is how Europe would look like, and the continent I feel like is still very tense, so there could be a cold war between the Axis and the Allies, mostly due to Czechoslovakia feeling very threatened as the rival of Poland, Austria and Hungary expanded so much after the war, while Czechoslovakia only gained the Kłodzko county and Sorbian majority territories. This is why I could see Czechoslovakia gaining Silesia as compensation for their rival neighboring countries expanding so much, but it's difficult to say. Overall, I would have these borders in the year of 1945. Now I briefly want to mention Asia and Japan's role there. Some people claim that since Italy would not go ultranationalist, that Japan wouldn't do the same. If this is the case, they would likely at least retain Korea, however if they invade China like historically, they would not take French into China, as France would be still alive and doing well, so Japan is never embargoed and does their biggest mistake of their life. To put it simply, I have no idea what would happen in Asia, which is good since the video is not exactly about them. Still, as the Soviet Union is defeated, China is unlikely to go communist, that's for sure. Going over to Europe, I want to finish this up by covering the modern day. France and Britain will have to decolonize, but the thing is that Italy can keep Libya and Tunisia, as these had very low populations compared to that one of Italy, so the Italians could have successfully colonized them. In East Africa, no matter if Italy gets Ethiopia or not, I don't think that they would get to keep them, as even Ethiopia today has double the population of Italy, so it would basically become unholdable. However, the Italian colony of Eritrea at one point was about 25% ethnically Italian, and even their capital of Asmara was majority Italian, so I can see Italy to potentially keep Eritrea, or perhaps to give them autonomy, doing something similar to what Portugal tried to do historically with pure continentalism. Italian Somalia, however, I see as being lost, and due to the weird borders of Libya and no Jubaland for Somalia, by Italy being neutral in the Great War, even if everything else that I said is false, it will still result in a larger Kenya, Algeria, Sudan, Egypt and Niger. In Europe, regarding the modern day, I have cooked these borders up, which you had seen prior, however Italy is now much more influential and potentially the leaders of Europe, as Germany is non-existent in this alternate history, so Italian culture would be promoted worldwide, and Italy as a whole would be much more better off. Now there is something fun regarding Italy and East Africa, as Italy could have failed their invasion of Ethiopia, which happened in 1935, and if you want to see what would happen there, I would suggest that you check out this video. Thank you for watching and I hope to see you there. Goodbye.